Even if you've never heard of John Kluge, you're definitely living in the world he created. For a few years, he was the wealthiest man in America. When he died, his net worth was a staggering $6.5 billion. That's enough to buy New York Knicks tickets and still have enough pocket change for a private island. But the reason his legacy as a pioneering media mogul has flown under the radar for so long is because he hated the showboating that's so common in modern billionaires. He hated that behavior as much as cookie-cutter executive thinking, risk-averse business decisions, and following the crowd. These might be the typical lessons from an Ivy League business school. But John Kluge's rags to riches life story contains more sagely wisdom than an economics book authored by the Dalai Lama. In fact, his strategy for utilizing emerging technologies and seeking out sectors where he had little competition has become the playbook for every Silicon Valley CEO. So, how did this German immigrant philanthropist achieve the American dream? How did he flip floundering businesses into $1 billion empire? And how did schoolyard games teach him the basics of business when he was just a kid? Chapter 1. Natural-born businessmen. John Werner Kluge was born in 1914 in Chemnitz, a manufacturing city in Germany. A backdrop of business naturally fed into his upbringing, but it was his father's tragic death in World War I that helped spark his entrepreneurial spirit. That's because his mother had to work 6 days a week as a typist to provide for John and his grandmother. The fact they lived in a cramped, run-down tenement house while the rest of the country's economy was booming must have given him an early, bitter taste of financial hardship. Yet, John was able to test his money-making muscles before he'd even earn his first dollar, or Deutschmark. He did this by playing marbles. Those small glass orbs were the Pokemon cards of yesteryear, and just like any playground trend, John wanted to get involved. But what made him different was he played for keeps. That might not sound like a big deal to you, but if you're a broke child, then you know the value of fashionable toys are priceless. So, if you're going to play for keeps, you have to be good. You have to take risks. Young Kluge became so formidable at calculating chances that he claimed to have won more than 2,000 marbles. No wonder neighboring kids stopped playing with him. He found new friends though, because his family moved to the other side of the city. Here, his mother met a German-born widower visiting from America, which is how John Kluge immigrated to the US at just 8 years old. It was 1922. Lines of immigrants aboard the USS George Washington waved at the Statue of Liberty. Kluge was so taken in by the city that he vowed to return one day. In the meantime, the family settled just outside of Detroit, Michigan. Kluge's stepfather wanted him to follow in his contracting and painting footsteps. No doubt he was motivated by providing stability. But it was too late. Kluge was hooked on being an entrepreneur. He sold apples from his family's fruit trees. He delivered newspapers. He washed windows. He even set up a lawn cutting and snow shoveling business where he trained local boys to work for him. Kluge had employees, franchises, and an empire before he was even fluent in English. That's pretty impressive for a 10-year-old kid. Yet, despite this early start, Kluge said he was yet to take the biggest risk of his life. Shortly after graduating 8th grade, his stepfather doubled his efforts to make Kluge leave school to work for him full-time. The lure of stability must have been tempting for a poor boy who grew up in poverty. But Kluge knew education was going to be his key to success. He reasoned that if he had gotten this far from what he could teach himself, then utilizing a real education would take him to great heights. So, he persuaded his stepfather to let him attend high school for a single year. Seriously, how many kids begged their parents to let them go to school? Once that year was up, his stepdad forbade Kluge from attending school again. So John did the riskiest thing of his life. He ran away from home to make a name for himself. So how did he do it? Chapter 2. The difference between learning and getting an education. Kluge was now a homeless high schooler. Then one day, he was washing the car of a teacher who had changed his life, Garcia Gray DeRitt. As soon as she heard that the student moonlighting as a car washer had nowhere to live, she brought him into her home. Here, he got his real education. Kluge was so dedicated to learn to speak English without his German accent that he always carried a German to English dictionary with him. Kids teased him, but that only strengthened his determination. But it was his teacher's guests that gave him a valuable insight into the way people conduct themselves. Garcia Gray DeRitt was so respected in their town that the likes of judges and high-profile businessmen would visit her to drink tea and chat about world affairs. Over time, young Kluge gleaned worldly knowledge from their interactions. He claimed these so-called signposts into American culture became a valuable foundation to his business philosophy. Given how secretive Kluge had been, we can't know for sure what those are, but we can imagine it's something to do with the details of business deals. Later in life, close friends and biographers praised Kluge's love for hammering out a good business deal. He loved the personal interaction that comes with a joint venture, they said. This knack for working with people, coupled with his thirst for taking risk. By the time he was in college, his reputation for studiousness was eclipsed by his infamy at the card table. First, he spent a year at the then-named Detroit City College before transferring to Columbia on a scholarship. He studied economics, no surprise there. No doubt, his formal education in number crunching helped him make a formidable poker player during dormitory card games. In fact, his gambling was so well known amongst the students that even the dean caught wind of his antics. Upon being summoned to the dean's office, the angry head threatened to revoke Kluge's scholarship should he ever catch him playing cards again. The witty Kluge promised the dean that he'd never be caught again. True to his word, he made sure that the school never figured out he was still gambling on campus. Perhaps the thing that kept him in the teacher's good books were his high grades and business acumen. He ran a shoe business, a garment side hustle, and even sold school supplies to fellow students. He was the dining hall's meal pricer, and at one point was the private secretary for the son of the president of China. This inspired him to journey to China upon graduation to set up his own company to rival the East India Trading Company. Unfortunately for him, the ensuing war between China and Japan ruined everything. So, upon graduation, he took a job at a paper company on one strange condition. He worked without salary, but with expenses covered, and 1/3 interest in the business if he doubled sales. The owner's jaw must have hit the floor when they heard this proposal from some fresh college grad. And their jaws must have fallen through the floorboards when they saw how John Kluge, true to his word, hit his sales targets with ease. Kluge now had an education, capital, and clout to officially start his company. But before he could cut his own path, his prospects would be affected by a little thing called World War II. Chapter 3. Building an Empire from Ash. Maybe it was his German heritage and American patriotism. Or maybe it was his gambling skills and uncanny ability to read an opponent. Whichever caught the attention of the US government first, the young college graduate served his adopted country by becoming an intelligence agent. That's right. Kluge was trained to think like a spy. Kluge worked at the legendary P.O. Box 1142, the codename for a super secretive interrogation facility which employed unconventional methods. Methods such as swimming pools, leisurely activities, and using fake Russian officers to make the POWs fearful of being shipped to Siberia if they failed to comply. Notable residents included German rocket scientist Werner von Braun, inventor of infrared decoding Heinz Schilk, and even the infamous spy master Reinhard Gehlen. It's fair to say that if your 9-to-5 is playing 4D chess with the sharpest minds Nazi Germany has to offer, then by the time the war is over, you'll be smarter than Einstein with a Neuralink. Assuming Musk delivers on a promise for once. Once Kluge was relieved of war duties, he saw how the America he immigrated to was different. The war had changed the dynamics of business, manufacturing, and economics. He must have wondered whether the wisdom he'd been building would apply in a post-war world. For example, people weren't sure if radio was going to stick around. On the one hand, he'd see a boom in the lead-up to the global conflict. Yet the emergence of television and cinema proved images were really worth 1,000 words. But Kluge wasn't fazed. He was never one to follow the herd. In fact, he recognized that the radio was about to get a second wind. Admittedly, he understood this from an article in the Wall Street Journal. It detailed how raw materials for television were costly given how wartime efforts had diverted resources so drastically. Kluge reasoned, correctly, that as much as radio was on the ropes, it wasn't over until the fat lady sings. Or at least, until the fat lady sings on TV. And if there was still a user base for radio, what was the rush to give up on the medium? Plus, from there, a viable radio station could leapfrog into other ventures. He figured out that he could turn the $15,000 startup cost for a radio station into $340,000 within a year. And that's in 1946. By 2024 calculations, he was looking at raking in $5.75 million. This dovetailed beautifully into his lifelong business mantra: make money and minimize taxes. There's no point of having huge turnover if your overhead is crazy. Kluge understood the potential in connecting directly with consumers, especially for advertisers. So he snapped up an independent station called WGAY. In a few years, with more capital behind him and changes in the television landscape, he was able to snap up a few small TV stations and a couple more radio stations. Slowly but surely, he was building his own network, demonstrating his knack for utilizing tech and watching the bottom line. This same approach helped run a food brokerage. His ventures into food distribution introduced Americans to Fritos and Cheetos, but it was his pivot away from mom-and-pop stores and two chains with potential for longevity that helped redefine the food industry's product pipeline. So, if you've ever wondered who introduced Cheeto dust to the nation, you can thank Kluge. Soon, his experience and insight even made him a go-to consultant for advertising and distribution. However, despite these successes, there was a lack of focus. Kluge still needed to figure out how to leverage his growing media empire with his ventures in advertising and distribution. To us modern-day viewers, it might seem obvious how he transformed his business dream into a multimedia reality. For Kluge, he had to wait for another business to go under before he could swoop in to save the day. Chapter 4. One man's trash is another man's treasure. Okay, here's the quick backstory of Dumont Television. Near the start of the 20th century, it was the pioneer of American commercialized television. Its rivals were NBC and CBS, but at its height, Dumont was the biggest player in town. It was so big that the Federal Trade Commission had to step in to stop it from monopolizing the industry. To some, that's a good problem to have. Unfortunately, Dumont had always been in a precarious financial situation, despite its industry dominance, and things got worse because of technological changes. Imagine you're a software engineer with an app or video game to sell, but you can only ship on one distribution platform. Do you stick it on Steam or on the Apple App Store? What about Epic Games or Google's Play Store? Back in the days of airwaves, the equivalents were the frequencies of radio waves. The FCC verdict forced Dumont to focus on UHF, ultra-high frequency, which had not yet become the standard. The direct line of sight needed by the tech meant mountains and forests blocked the signals. In effect, Dumont had lost its rural audience with the flip of a switch. It was like being forced to only make HD products in a world of standard definition. Dumont's vast empire was turning hollow. Even their partnership deal with Paramount did little to clot their hemorrhaging business. Who in their right mind would buy it? John Kluge. That's who. Where others saw risk, he saw potential. Competitors may have been prepared to pay an arm and a leg for a profitable company, but Kluge saw the value in growing an independent, especially if you can make a beachhead before rivals showed up. After purchasing a controlling interest in Paramount, Kluge scooped the remnants of the Dumont network. In 1958, he had become its board chairman and largest shareholder. He even got the bulk of the shares directly from the founder, Alan B. Dumont, for around $6 million. Kluge reasoned, correctly once again, that Alan Dumont's problem was that he was good at building television studios, but terrible at marketing. Thankfully, Kluge had vast experience running a consumer-focused company. Plus, Kluge had acquired an outdoor advertising firm and direct mailing enterprise. Now, with his radio stations and nationwide television circuit, he had a way for advertisers to reach any audience in any state on any medium. Heck, one of his stations ran an advertising campaign that was so in your face that it promised one lucky winner a one-way ticket to Australia for their mother-in-law. Nowadays, an in-house multimedia advertising campaign is a common tactic for any big company. But back then, this was radical. In one bold move, Kluge had laid the groundwork for a revolution in media. The printing press may have spread mass communications, but Kluge was the guy who stuck it on buses, billboards, and before soap operas. Now was the era of metro media. But what's a revolution without its doctrine? Chapter 5. The Big Payday. With Kluge manning the helm in 1959, their first year saw a $5.6 million gross. The year after, they expanded into more profitable properties. But that wouldn't have happened if Kluge hadn't been a diligent leader. He was quoted as saying, "Growth is an enabling factor in attracting the best people, and the best people are essential to the organization. There's nothing worse than having a ceiling on top of young, creative people. Other executives might be trained to keep employees in their place, but Kluge recognized the benefits and risks of having his employees work with him instead of for him. He knew that once he had cultivated a high-grade management team, he just needed to trust them to do their job. Why would he micromanage people now if he didn't micromanage them when he was cutting lawns in Detroit all those years ago? But Kluge didn't kick back doing nothing. He policed the expenses like the IRS hunting Al Capone. Once, he called up an executive to congratulate him on having the highest phone bill that month. From then on, his company's phone bills were low. He was such a stickler for keeping costs down that Forbes eventually named him the cheapskate billionaire. But Kluge said he wasn't being frugal out of greediness. He knew that the television business was so fragile that it could collapse if their cash flow wasn't in check. For example, the HQ was in New Jersey, not New York, because the rent was cheaper. He needed a robust budget to weather the lows, and there were lows. A venture into Laserdisc proved Kluge didn't always get it right with emerging tech. Not to mention the lawsuits. One was from a former television producer trying to secure rights to their kids' show. In response, Kluge ordered the destruction of the original tapes. The result? An $18 million payday for the ex-employee. Oops. But there were highs too. Shows like MASH and All in the Family were big money spinners for Metromedia. But Kluge was tired of making business decisions on stock value. He pined for the days when he didn't have to listen to risk-averse shareholders. So, he took out a personal loan of $1.3 billion so that he could pay out Metromedia. Next to the decision to run away from home, this was the biggest risk of his entire life. But this gamble paid off. Big time. One day, Rupert Murdoch came knocking. He was interested in the network of local stations Metromedia had cultivated, plus its inroads into the emerging technology of cellular. He offered Kluge upwards of $4 billion for the ecosystem, which Kluge gracefully accepted. Metromedia's network of radio and television stations became the core of Fox News Media, and Kluge became the wealthiest man in America. Yet despite such media attention, the media pioneer kept a low profile through his life, business deals, and ex-wives. He seldom gave interviews, ducked out of high society, and never put his name on a building. Even when he donated $60 million to his former university before updating that donation as time went on, he remarked that he'd rather change minds than have his name on a monument. In fact, he stipulated that his donation go towards scholarships for minorities. He didn't want the hardships he faced as an immigrant to impede anyone else. To date, 200 students are benefiting from his scholarship at any one time. In his golden years, he focused on philanthropy. He gave huge donations to AIDS research and even collected Australian Aboriginal art as part of his relationship with museums. The remaining smaller business ventures of Metromedia fizzled out until the name was seldomly recognized by anyone outside of economic history. Thankfully, for a man who is all about building businesses on relationships, risk, and innovation, it makes sense that his headstone offers us one last playful piece of insight for the entrepreneurs of the future. I'm wiser. I sold my body for fertilizer. Leonardo Del Vecchio turned eyewear from archaic medical devices to a must-have fashion accessory. By the time he died at 87 years old, he'd created an entire monopoly through his parent company, Luxottica, and had accumulated a net worth of $21.9 billion. He owned companies like Ray-Bans, had licensing deals with Gucci, and health insurance infrastructure like iMed. However, some say his market share is an optical illusion. Only 10% of global sales are from Luxottica. Apparently, his crossover with luxury brands is what makes us think he was a bigger player than he actually was. Then again, critics point to the mountain of evidence which suggests his vertically integrated conglomerate controlled the market on so many levels that they could get away with jacking up the prices. Not only was he the guy that made sunglasses cool, he was also the guy that made sunglasses expensive. So, how did Leonardo Del Vecchio go from little orphan boy to one of the richest men in Europe? Are his acts of charity honest, or can people see right through them? And how did he get away with selling sunglasses for $800? Chapter 1. The Birth of a Visionary. 1935. Italy is in the grips of Mussolini's fascist regime. A vegetable street vendor dies a few months before the birth of his child, leaving his pregnant wife to raise their family alone. When the child arrives on May 2nd, his name is Leonardo. Like Da Vinci and the leader of the Ninja Turtles, this moniker is common with visionaries and leaders. Young Leo spends the first few years of his life with 5 other siblings. They grow up in Milan in truly impoverished conditions. Italy's economy had worsened throughout World War II, leaving Leonardo's already poor family with even less money and hope for a prosperous future. So, his mother makes a drastic decision. She hands 7-year-old Leonardo over to an orphanage run by nuns. Whether out of fear of losing her child to starvation or street gangs, Milan's historical orphanage of Martinet was the only course of action she could take. Plenty of billionaire stories have a rags to riches tale, but only Leonardo Del Vecchio has an origin story with strict Catholic nuns in a broke post-war country. Even Oliver Twist would feel lucky for what he had. You wouldn't need to be a Hollywood screenwriter to imagine his early years were filled with beatings, homesickness, and crying into his meatballs. Yet, young Leonardo had some talents. It turns out he was good with his hands. Leonardo developed craftsmanship thanks to his curious mind and diligent work ethic. This landed him an apprenticeship after leaving the orphanage at 14 years old. He worked for a tool and die maker, but they never addressed him by his first name. They simply addressed him as boy. Leonardo may have had skills to get hired, but he didn't have the respect to get noticed. But he didn't care so long as he got his paycheck. 300 lira wasn't enough to strike it out on his own. It was barely enough to get by. But by squirreling it away, he'd save enough to study engraving at the Brera Academy of Art. By the time he had graduated with that diploma, he was out of institutions and on his own. Thankfully, he had everything he needed to stake his fortune: passion, skills, and hardship. All he needed now was a way to focus these into a singular vision, so he set out to the north of Italy to find it. Chapter 2. Reshaping the Framework. 400. 22-year-old Leonardo Del Vecchio moved to Pieve Ticino. He worked in a metal engraving factory against the backdrop of a stunning mountain range where he discovered that he had a knack for creating metal glasses frames. At that point in history, glasses were still mostly a medical apparatus. Sure, some people would have reading glasses, but the demand was nowhere near as high as it is today. You can't expect a tiny town in 1950s northern Italy to have a drive-through optometrist. By focusing on the tiny details, he carved out a specialism. But he also lost part of his finger in a factory accident, so maybe he wasn't focusing on everything. What did catch his eye was how glasses were more than a practical instrument. They were an extension of your personality. This was the focus he needed to decide his next big step. In 1961, he moved to Agordo in the province of Belluno, the home of the Italian eyewear industry. To say this was a risky move would be an understatement. Here, he was a small fish in a big pond who was trying to jump to an even bigger pond. Leonardo may have found his niche, but there was every chance he'd be swallowed up by the competition. Even if he had a sense of what the next big thing would be, there was no guarantee that he wouldn't be beaten to the punch. In fact, around this time, big luxury names like Gucci and Armani were already wondering how to make glasses fashionable. So he strategically positioned himself so it would be in his competitor's interest not to destroy him. He focused on making parts for other companies. This made him less threatening, because he wouldn't be eating into their consumer base, and his business-to-business structure meant he could work with the rivals of clients. The quality of his work spoke volumes, so his craftsmanship kept him ahead from the other guys doing the same thing. Bit by bit, he built up his boutique service into an operation with 14 full-time employees, all working hard to specialize in small metal parts for glasses. For any business person, this was a good gig. He developed his craft, earned good money, and even got to learn more about his industry. Anyone else would have stayed where they were and not rocked the boat. But Leonardo saw what they didn't. He saw how the eyewear industry was reliant on other companies doing different parts. He figured that he could create a vertically integrated company, one that sourced its own raw materials, manufactured its own goods, and brought them to market. Then he'd be a force to reckon with. In fact, it would streamline production, reduce costs, and make the business more flexible to trends. It would foster innovation whilst maintaining high quality. This second eureka moment was the motivation Leonardo needed to change things up. If he was ever going to take eyewear to the next level, then this was the method to do it. He first tested the waters by pivoting away from creating components to assembling complete spectacle frames. By investing in a new machinery for his craft, he was able to improve his reputation even more. He was getting so many orders that he had to stop working for other companies and focus on his own. It was time to go all in. In 1971, he exited the contract manufacturing business and devoted his attention and resources into making Luxottica the next big thing. But this had its own set of problems. Chapter 3. Seeing the bigger picture. Reorganizing Luxottica's structure and strategy gave him the chance to stand out from the crowd, but the trade-off was twofold. By previously focusing on business clients, Leonardo would gain insight about their inner workings. He could learn from their mistakes, follow in the footsteps of their success, and keep an ear on the ground for market changes. But now, those benefits were gone. The second issue was losing touch with customers. By not focusing on custom manufacturing, he could only service the general needs of demographics. This meant he couldn't ask them what they were thinking. If a product bombed, he couldn't ask them why. He'd have to decipher raw data to figure out if the problem was in pricing, marketing, or manufacturing. Yet, there is no reward without risk. And his risk paid off well. For the next few years, Luxottica held its own against bigger competitors thanks to the higher quality products. But reputation won't pay the bills forever. Sooner or later, a previous business client would figure out what made his frame so popular and pull the rug out from under him. And if more than one competitor figured it out, Leonardo would be back in a metal workshop faster than he could say arrivederci. Thankfully, Leonardo was a craftsman. He understood that glasses frames were like business. By carefully designing each component, no matter how small, the structure would be more than the sum of its parts. So he pulled ahead of his competitors by doing what they didn't. In 1974, he acquired the wholesale distribution company Scaroni. Their logistics and sales services helped Leonardo reach customers directly, even if it meant more responsibility. You might be thinking, so what? There isn't a conglomerate on planet Earth that doesn't acquire other businesses. It's all about vertical integration. Well, hindsight is 2020. No doubt Leonardo's competitors are kicking themselves for not seeing what Leonardo saw. By slowly moving into the infrastructure of the industry, he found a way to compete indirectly. He'd save money by cutting out middlemen, streamlined his reach to customers, and could offer distribution services to others. Sooner or later, other businesses would need him just like how they needed him when he was a humble metalworker. But some say this quest for dominance clouded his vision. Chapter 4. A Clearer Future. The Luxottica Group experiment was doing pretty well. For over a decade, the company slowly grew. Money was good, customer satisfaction was up, and there was no reason to rock the boat. But Leonardo wanted more. He had ambitions to supply and distribute his company's raw materials. Plus, he wanted a stronger retail presence. Every time he relied on another company for part of his business plan, he was losing influence. He wanted to find a way to expand his operations in the most efficient way possible. Conventional growth wasn't going to cut it though, especially if eyewear was still mostly seen as a niche industry. There was a ceiling to where they could go, and he hit it. To break through to the next level, Leonardo would need a revolution. So, he made one. In 1988, Leonardo struck a deal with Giorgio Armani. Like other luxury designers, Armani had been dreaming up ways to turn more items into luxury products, but they weren't eyewear experts like Leonardo. Yet other eyewear experts lacked the pizzazz and flair which imbued the Luxottica brand. So when Leonardo pitched how glasses could be an object people buy like bags and shoes, Armani knew he had finally found the designer he'd been searching for. Others tried to create a revolution, but Leonardo led the charge. Glasses were now hotter than hot. They were cooler than cool. They were a must-have item for anyone interested in fashion. Soon, other fashion designers followed and sought him out for licensing deals, yet Leonardo wanted to strike while the iron was hot. 1 year after the iconic deal with Armani, Leonardo moved the company into the retail sector. Many thought it was a risky move. Retail was a different beast, and the profit margins don't leave much room for error. But Leonardo disagreed. If Louis Vuitton has its own outlets and shopping malls, why not Luxottica? After all, this was a time when the likes of Nike and Reebok were finding ways to set up their own storefronts instead of relying solely on shops like Foot Locker. If he didn't get there first, someone else would. He started buying up outlets to convert into Luxottica shops. Yet, expansion remained slow. He was up against the clock, but limited by his capital. So, 1 year after that, he listed the company on the New York Stock Exchange. It was all or nothing. Not only did this raise visibility of the brand, but it provided the vital funds for aggressive expansion. Leonardo's next target was United States Shoes Corporation, but not because he wanted to get into footwear, though it's good fashion advice to match the color of your shoes with your glasses. He bought them out because they owned LensCrafters, who was, at the time, America's largest eyewear retail chain. It cost $1.4 billion, a crazy amount for a company that only started 34 years earlier in some remote mountain town. Upon purchasing all of their physical stores, Leonardo gutted and sold off parts of the US Shoes Corporation that he didn't need. After all, the key to good craftsmanship is knowing what you do need and what you don't need. Not every retail store changed its name to Luxottica though. Not that they needed to. If anyone wanted to sell in Leonardo's outlets, he got a cut. So even if the sales of his personal brand were really only 10%, he was still getting a cut of the other 90%. But old Leo wasn't done just yet. He had other plans to vertically integrate. Some ideas were questionable, others were immoral, and maybe one or two were downright illegal. Chapter 5. Acquisitions, Reflections, and Optical Illusions. In 2000, Luxottica was listed in Milan, the home of luxury fashion. This gave Luxottica a second wind of capital to acquire even more companies. This would be Leonardo's final phase for world domination. Italian brand Vogue was the first to be swallowed up in 1990, followed by Persil in 1995 and Ray-Bans in 1999. In 2001, Luxottica bought out Sunglass Hut, thereby expanding its retail reach even more. He even got a slice of the Walmart pie. 2003 was the year Leonardo snapped up Australian brand OPSM, with Pearl Vision joining the portfolio in 2004. When he wasn't buying up retailers or brands, he was moving into the health insurance sector. He now had a foothold in different countries, continents, and markets. Wherever you went for your glasses, you had to go through Leo. As you can imagine, this raised concerns about monopolization. Luxottica defends its size by saying that only a fraction of global sales are under the Luxottica brand. But that's just smoke and mirrors. Look what happened with Oakley. It started when the relationship between the two companies became strained after a price disagreement. Exact details are unknown. Maybe Luxottica wanted a bigger profit share, or perhaps a cheaper price for orders. Whatever the disagreement was, Luxottica dropped Oakley from their stores. As you can imagine, this affected the sales of Oakley. The sales affected the stock value, and the stock value made them cheaper to buy. No prizes for guessing who bought them. You don't need a Harvard business degree to argue that this was market manipulation. When Luxottica was pressed for comment during an episode of 60 Minutes, a representative responded in the most Italian mafia way possible. There were some issues between the two companies, but they understood life was better together. Such market power is how Leonardo's machine can mark up prices by 1,000%. Even the founder of LensCrafters said that buying eyeglasses for as much as $800 was a complete ripoff. Yet Leonardo still wanted to expand. Because even though he'd taken over the frames industry, he didn't make the lenses. That changed in 2018 when Luxottica merged with French lens company Essilor, and the guy in charge, Leonardo. He had finally accomplished his ambition to be part of every stage of the eyewear industry. No surprise that a man with his bank account went on record to say how much he hates paying taxes. However, he did qualify this statement by saying, "But I like sleeping at night." Some have pointed to his charitable work as proof of his good heart. For example, Luxottica restored the Accademia Bridge in Venice and even set up a foundation to produce vision services to underserved communities. But let's be honest, that's a tax write-off. You've seen how Mr. Beast funded cataract surgeries to combat blindness, so clearly Leonardo could have bankrolled a bigger project. Then again, curing vision problems doesn't make good business sense for a man who sells glasses. To be fair, he gifted $16 million worth of shares to employees, but some say that's a drop in the ocean compared to the money they made him, and the damage he's done to the industry. Then there's the Luxottica Museum he opened up in 1991 to document the history of his company and the fashion trends of glasses. As you can imagine, it's not going to cover its shady dealings with Oakley or its monopoly business structure. But maybe that's another PR move. Perhaps Leonardo's greatest skill wasn't his vision of the future, but how we view the past. Media moguls don't tend to be as well known as A-list celebrities and world leaders, but then again, Rupert Murdoch isn't your average billionaire news broadcasting tycoon. They call him the modern-day Citizen Kane, because his rise from small-time local newspaper to multinational conglomerate CEO has all the twists and turns of a classic rags to riches story. Kind of. Even his private life feels like an episode of Succession with sibling rivalries, high-profile divorces, and the occasional television appearances. But Rupert Murdoch is a whole different beast to Orson Welles' character in the classic Hollywood tale of the newspaper industry. Murdoch's influence on the size, shape, and nature of media is as widespread as it is devastating. Some good, some bad, some ugly. Given that the Australian-born media maverick is close to a century old, it seems fair to say that his time at the top is coming to an end. But will his influence survive the rise of social media and alternative journalism, or is his legacy as dead as legacy media? Born on March 11th, way back in 1931, he was named Keith, but since a young age, he went by the middle name he received from his maternal grandfather, Rupert. He was raised on a small ranch named Cruden Farm in the south of Melbourne, Australia. But this wasn't some humble John Steinbeck-esque situation. The stone building was adorned with colonial pillars, and the insides were furnished with fine painting, a library, plus grand piano. Here, young Rupert, spent his time riding horses through expansive green farmland. But his mother denies his early years were overindulgent. It was a very normal childhood. I suppose he was lucky to be brought up in attractive surroundings. His parents were both native Australians who had lived in Scotland, specifically Cruden Bay, where their farm got its namesake. Though young Murdoch would not return to his Scottish roots, he did follow in his father's footsteps, who was, at the time, a well-known journalist. In fact, Sir Keith Murdoch Sr. owned a number of local and regional newspapers, such as the Herald in Melbourne and Brisbane's own Courier Mail, plus Sunday Mail, and the simply named News. That's not a bad portfolio for a man whose early career was hindered by a stutter. However, he did receive some recognition during the early struggles of his press career. During his time in World War I, his reporting on the mismanagement of the Gallipoli campaign and the hardships of the troops got noticed. This helped to shake up the military leadership. No doubt, this proved to his son the power of the newspaper. Of his childhood, Rupert Murdoch remarked, "I was brought up in a publishing home, a newspaper man's home. I saw that life at close range, and never really considered any other." From an early age, he was groomed to work in printing, which put him on track for an esteemed education. He graduated from a prestigious Australian boarding school called Geelong Grammar, before moving to London in 1949 to study philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford University. Apparently, he was a typical student. He drank too much, chased girls, gambled, and even had a bust of Lenin in his dorm. He was so involved with left-wing activism that he participated in various Labour Party organizations, which earned him the nickname Red Rupert. But a few years later, Keith Sr. suddenly died from cancer, leaving a 22-year-old Rupert Murdoch to become owner of a crumbling media empire. Following a quick apprenticeship at the Daily Express, Murdoch returned down under to revive his late father's business. And revive them he did. He learned fast. He immersed himself in all aspects of the daily operations, like writing headlines, designing page layouts, and even laboring in the printing rooms. However, it was his business savvy that rejuvenated the ailing companies. When his father had died, the death duties had eaten up most of the stock he held, leaving Rupert and his family with little to play with. What they did have were some failing newspapers in Adelaide and a remote station in Broken Hill. But by controversially pivoting towards crime, sex, and scandal, circulation soared. He was starting to make a name for himself, so had to keep on his toes. A rival daily newspaper tried to buy his papers from him quietly, but once Murdoch caught wind of their scheme, he ran a front page denouncing the move along with an editorial about the evils of press monopoly. He caught a taste of being sued too. One time, an Aborigine was accused of murder, but many felt the evidence was dubious, including Murdoch. So his papers came to the defense. This action was unpopular, and his small company was dragged through the courts on charges of libel. In the end, they were acquitted. Not to be hindered, Murdoch spent this next stretch of his career expanding at an impressive rate. By 1956, Murdoch had bought out Perth's Sunday Times, which too was revamped to fit with his commercially successful sensationalism. By 1960, Murdoch had broken into Sydney's market with his purchase of Mirror. He transformed the struggling paper into the city's bestseller. By 1965, Murdoch had set his sights on founding a brand new paper. He was done with buying failing businesses, and instead wanted to make something a success from day one. Australia's first national daily paper was created that same year and aptly named The Australian. No small feat given the wide expanses of land between the coasts. But having all those printing presses dotted around the country made getting the news through the outback much more possible. But Rupert wasn't going to stay in the land of kangaroos forever. In fact, he'd eventually relinquish his Australian citizenship to become a citizen of the US of A, thereby enjoying all the rights and tax breaks of very hardworking billionaires. By 1968, he was 37 years old, with an empire valued at around $50 million, so it was time to make moves in London. Once again, he used his tried and tested tool for success, buying a failing paper, inject some sensationalism, and hey, presto, a money-making machine. For those in the UK, it might be hard to imagine a time when The Sun was just a struggling daily tabloid. For the younger generation, you might not be familiar with The Sun's inclusion of naked women, another controversial tactic that boosted sales. There was one other tabloid that Murdoch bought out, The News of the World. At the time, it was an enormously popular Sunday edition. With a firm hold in London's Fleet Street, Murdoch recalibrated his sights on a new target, a bigger one with more risk and ambition, one that spoke to his long-held love for gambling, America. 1973 was the year he touched down in the US. He acquired Texas-based tabloid The San Antonio News. The year after, he founded a brand new tabloid called The Star before heading to New York 2 years later to buy The Post. With a strong presence in 3 major English-speaking countries, 1979 became the year to consolidate. The name for his holding company was News Corporation, more simply known as News Corp. Though Murdoch continued to add news outlets to his portfolio throughout the 80s and 90s, such as the Chicago Sun-Times, Village Voice, and New York Magazine, his primary focus on print news was coming to an end. That's because the medium of television had developed enough to become the new battleground for news. A quick pause before we get into Fox News and the impact of the 24-hour news cycle as we indulge in the spirit of the Murdoch media machine by investigating his own private life. Let's quickly go over his 4 ex-wives and 6 children. The first Mrs. Murdoch was Patricia Booker, a former flight attendant from Melbourne. Married in 1956, divorced in 1967, with their only child Prudence entering the news publishing dynasty in 1958. Prudence has held several directorial roles in News Corp, but apparently is the only one of his children not directly competing for his business affections. Ex-wife number 2 was Anna Maria de Peyster, a Scottish and Australian journalist who scooped $1.7 billion in the divorce. Her marriage to Murdoch lasted from 1967 until 1999 and produced 3 heirs, Elizabeth, Lachlan, and James, all of whom are executives of sorts. Less than 3 weeks after officially breaking things off with Anna, Murdoch married Wendy Deng, a media executive almost 37 years his junior. She birthed 2 more daughters for Rupert, Grace and her younger sister Chloe. In fact, Grace Murdoch's godfather is Tony Blair. But more on that later. The couple called it quits in 2013, but by 2016, Murdoch had found another wife, Jerry Hall. The former model and actress is still much younger than Murdoch, although he's only a bit older than her former partner Mick Jagger. Their marriage ended in 2022, yet Murdoch seemed like he hadn't given up on love. 1 year later, he proposed to his partner Anne Leslie Smith. However, the engagement was called off, apparently due to her infatuation with Tucker Carlson. Speaking of Fox News hosts, Murdoch is arguably most well known for setting up the 24-hour right-wing leaning channel. He wasn't jumping in the deep end though. He had been dipping his toes in the news media landscape by purchasing independent TV stations as well as 20th Century Fox Film Corp. His printing business also moved laterally by consolidating his academic and literary business into HarperCollins. Like any billionaire worth his salt, Murdoch bought and sold sports teams like the LA Dodgers and even had stakes in the LA Kings, the New York Rangers, plus the Lakers, the Knicks, and even Madison Square Garden. That means his newspapers printed scandals on the players of his teams who played in his arenas that were filmed by his television cameras to capture the moments that would be dramatized in movies, which could be adapted into novels that were reviewed in his newspapers. Whew. No doubt that Lennon bust from his student days would be proud to see him buying up the means of production. Speaking of production, Fox News was a game changer. Granted, CNN was the first network to do round-the-clock news coverage, but it's fair to say that it was Murdoch who took it to the next level. CNN's political influencing was small-time in comparison, though nonetheless damaging, according to the likes of Noam Chomsky. However, Fox News' approach was bombastic and in-your-face. He injected sensationalism into 24/7 news coverage, proving that the business model was viable. Cable news became a fiercely competitive landscape, and Fox News never shied from gloating about its success. It's been argued by many social scientists that the station's political discourse has a profound influence on election cycles. After all, it was the 1997 endorsement of Tony Blair by Murdoch's UK's papers that got the Labour Party into favour for the first time in 18 years. This begs the question, is Rupert Murdoch right-wing or left-wing? Fox News may be pro-Trump, but Rupert Murdoch is infamously opposed to the Orange Man in the White House. In fact, Fox News became too successful for Murdoch's own good. Take Tucker Carlson, the conservative commentator whose show was a ratings killer. That was until the once famed bow tie wearer was unceremoniously booted from the network. Rumors abounded over the cause. Carlson was getting too religious on the show. Murdoch's wife had a crush on him. Powerful shareholders were worried about the influence Carlson had on the direction of the network. Some say an impending scandal needed to be covered up to protect the network. No one knows for sure, but whatever the reason, getting rid of him proved Murdoch was losing his edge. Media commentators theorized that Fox believed it was the time slot that was the main attraction, not the guy behind the desk. Yet Tucker Carlson's first episode on his Twitter show torpedoed that logic with astronomical viewership. The real irony is that the platform he used, Twitter, is built on Murdoch's successful model for 24-hour news cycles. No doubt, legacy media is struggling to compete with the likes of internet shows. Even Joe Rogan has more listeners than Murdoch's radios combined, and with a smaller infrastructure. Murdoch's behemoth of an empire can't compete with the nimbleness of YouTube channels. Gatekeepers to publication have lost their power in a world of Substack. With so many cogs in Murdoch's machine, it's not a surprise that something would go wrong. Sooner or later, someone would live the life and shine a light on the news stories hiding within. The News of the World phone hacking scandal may have been a bigger deal in Europe, but the impact on Murdoch's reputation and empire has global ramifications. Though proof of phone hacking of celebrities and police had emerged between 2005 to 2006, it wasn't until 2011 that the story erupted. Through a high-profile court case, it was alleged that the News of the World, under direct orders, had tapped into people's phones for the purposes of illegally gathering scoops. Typical victims were celebrities, but the most egregious incident involved a murdered schoolgirl. It was claimed that journalists hacked the phones of Amanda Miley Dowler during her disappearance. It was alleged that they deleted voicemails to free up space so they could be the first to print updates on the case. However, by doing this, they falsely gave hope to Miley's family that she was still alive, whilst potentially impeding the police investigation that resulted in the apprehension of a serial killer. That was denied, of course, by the paper's editor, Piers Morgan. Not that it helped. Several News of the World employees were arrested and convicted. Executives were brought before Parliament to be grilled in an inquiry. Eventually, the public outrage forced Murdoch to shut down the newspaper. Murdoch was also criticized for staging a clearly rehearsed, PR-friendly opening speech when it was his time to speak in front of the television cameras. His attempt to garner sympathy fell short when he was custard-pied, leaving rival newspapers to relish in the moment with headlines like "Murdoch eats humble pie." In UK history, this scandal is one of the defining moments that has led to increased skepticism and distrust of the press. No doubt you can think of moments that were equivalent in the US. But this story wouldn't be a modern-day Citizen Kane if there wasn't hubris.
Something. And this is not as an excuse, maybe it's an explanation of my laxity. The News of the World is less than 1% of our company. I employ 53,000 people around the world. And I'm spread watching and appointing people whom I trust to run those divisions.
Murdoch started off as a plucky, left-leaning reporter who wanted to follow in his father's footsteps by exposing corruption and sticking up for the little guy. Now, he's the poster child for monopoly, propaganda, and political meddling. It seems the right time for him to retire, though perhaps the infighting amongst his children for the right to inherit the reins of News Corp have been for nothing. Murdoch is too out of touch to keep up with alternative media, and the structure of legacy media is crumbling under its own weight. It could be that Murdoch's vast empire, built up over decades, is simply yesterday's news. Masayoshi Son is the billionaire CEO of SoftBank, a technology investment firm with such a unique way of operating that it has reshaped business not only in Japan but across the world. Its portfolio includes 80 companies, including the likes of Uber, Nvidia, and Boston Dynamics. Anytime SoftBank appears on a startup's board of investors, you know it's going to be big one day, whether it really deserves it or not. Today, Masayoshi Son is unfortunately best known for the humiliating downfall of WeWork, something that his critics say is proof that Masayoshi Son's talent for spotting innovation is obsolete. But the man behind one of the most influential investment funds in the world worked his way up from the most humble of origins. His family was dirt poor in a country that didn't even recognize him as a citizen until he was a massively successful businessman. You don't go from a pig farmer living on the fringes of the law to one of the world's most influential billionaires without at least a few tricks that are worth learning something from. He once raised $45 billion worth of capital in a single meeting. But is that skill so impressive when you blow it on risky investments like pizza-making robots and experimental kindergartens? Chapter 1. Seeds of Ambition. Born 11th of August, 1957, Masayoshi Son was originally called Masayoshi Yasumoto to fit with Japanese society. It wasn't his family's choice though. The Japanese government forced Koreans to adopt different names. He's a third-generation Zainichi Korean, which means that his bloodline immigrated from Japanese-ruled Korea before the end of World War II. Zainichi Koreans are the second largest minority population in Japan, right after Chinese immigrants. Yet he wouldn't become a naturalized Japanese citizen until 1990. Discrimination and bigotry helped him grow, he says, because it proved that hard work will always get you noticed, even if you have to work harder than others. This means the life of Masayoshi Yasumoto was always about being on the edge of culture. In fact, he lived on the edge. Literally. His dad illegally built a house on land owned by Japan National Railways. It was here on the island of Kyushu that Masayoshi and his three other siblings were raised along with his father's pigs and chickens. Even though Masayoshi had technology in his backyard and nature in his living room, it was his father's business that became the real backdrop of his childhood. He saw how his father's black market sake business earned enough money to bring them out of poverty. In fact, his dad's rice alcohol hustle was enough to make them the first family in the neighborhood to own a car. Young Masayoshi had seen the growth of the railroad, the growth of farm animals, and now the growth of their standard of living. Next, they uprooted to a better area so the boys could attend a better school. Here, he focused on honing his business skills, especially since he read a best-selling book by Japan's head of McDonald's. Masayoshi was only 16, yet was captivated by the wisdom inside. He was desperate to meet the genius author, so he did everything he could to meet him. He must have called the guy's assistant 100 times. All he got was a firm no and a lengthy telephone bill. So he changed plans. The young buck flew into Tokyo to prove that he was serious about meeting him. Finally, he got 15 whole minutes with the busy businessman, which ended up being some of the most defining moments in Masayoshi Son's entire career. He asked the McDonald's master what business a young man like him should get into. The answer: don't look to the past. Look to the future industries. Look for the place where there is growth. Go into computer technology. So, he did. Chapter 2: Strong Roots and Computer Wires. The meeting with the head of Japan's McDonald's had galvanized Masayoshi. He returned home a changed man and immediately threw himself at getting a great education. In class, he was the top student, passing every test with flying colors. But he couldn't stop there. In fact, he couldn't stay there. They saw their son could only grow as big as his environment allowed, so they moved to the US for more opportunities. Completing high school took him just 3 weeks. After that, he attended the University of California, Berkeley to study computer science and economics. But it was a magazine article that he read when he was 19 years old that helped narrow the young genius's focus. The article was about a microchip. Rudimentary by our modern standards, sure. But for Masayoshi Son, the possibilities of computer power confirmed he was on the right path. Personal computers were coming. If tech was going to revolutionize consumer life and business structure, then he was going to make sure he was a pioneer. He entered the tech space before he'd even graduated. In the same way that Warren Buffett rented pinball machines to local barbers, Masayoshi Son imported arcade machines from Japan to stick in dormitories and diners. But he didn't stop there. While still studying, he and a few other buddies developed a sound translation device. Not only could it translate between Japanese and English, it could convert sentences into German. He graduated in 1980, but 1 year later, he sold the device to electronics giant Sharp Corporation for around $1 million. That's not a bad payday for a fresh-faced 20-year-old. Most people in a situation might have figured out how to retire early or invest it wisely, but Masayoshi Son recognized the value of investing in himself. He returned to Japan and got to work setting up his own business. A year and a half later, SoftBank was born. But this new chapter in life required something more. It required something to prove that Masayoshi had grown from a bright-eyed kid living on the outskirts of life into a capable tech entrepreneur who was front and center of this emerging market. It required him to change his name. He removed the Japanese-enforced Yasumoto and reinstated his Korean surname to become Masayoshi Son. To Koreans, he's a role model. To tech giants, he's a revolutionary. To investors, he's a maverick. Yet it would take some time for SoftBank to become the namesake it is now. Originally, SoftBank had to figure out how to navigate the uncharted territory of the consumer computer landscape. Chapter 3: Survival of the Fittest. In Japan, software is simply called soft, so having a bank or reservoir of software made the name logical. However, there were aspirations to play a vital part in society's infrastructure from day one. But before it could become a real bank of computer tech, it had to start as a humble telecommunications company. Initially, it distributed PC software throughout Japan. You could think of it like an old-school version of Steam, where a middleman does the hard work of pairing up clients with their ideal software. In 1982, SoftBank started publishing monthly magazines. One targeted manufacturers, the other targeted engineers. It was a smart move to cut above the noise of consumer-focused publications. By standing out this way, SoftBank was gaining public attention as a voice worth listening to. Masayoshi Son was being compared to Bill Gates, but Masayoshi Son differed in a significant way by placing his focus not on how to create the best tech now, but predicting where the best tech could emerge. Masayoshi Son viewed technology as waves. If they rise and fall, so too do technology cycles. He didn't view progress as a straight line. Surviving market turbulence was key to innovation. SoftBank Holdings Inc. was set up in America during 1994 to help identify opportunities in internet-based companies. Bill Gates may have been nervous about investing heavily into dot-com companies, but not the CEO of SoftBank. Such a move might be more commonplace nowadays, but this was still the decade where the internet's longevity was up for question. Someone thought it was still a fad, and the idea of dating someone online was about as normal as streaming yourself playing video games in a hot tub. By 1996, SoftBank had radically increased its number of internet investments. Masayoshi Son was betting everything that this new market was going to be the next big thing. For 3 days, Masayoshi Son was richer than Bill Gates, but then stocks dropped in value. At the time, it must have seemed unstoppable. But with hindsight, we all know that this growth happened alongside the expansion of the dot-com bubble. And when the bubble burst in 2000, it burst hard. Once viable internet startups and businesses went up in digital smoke. Some instantly, and some over months. And some held on for a few years before finally being taken out back and being put out of their misery. SoftBank went down too. Well, almost. Pretty much all of its investments turned into dust. Almost $70 billion of net worth. After 6 months, share price had dropped by 99%. Thankfully, SoftBank had an ace in the hole. Masayoshi Son had seen the potential in a little e-commerce company called Alibaba. Ever heard of it? Now, it's the biggest competitor to Amazon and the go-to marketplace for every dropshipper studying day trading. But Masayoshi Son snapped it up when it was a struggling company in need of investment. Biographers would say this decision sums up his knack for recognizing and supporting future market leaders during the infancy of their niche. That seems a bit fanciful given that Masayoshi Son admits that Jack Ma, CEO of Alibaba, had no business plan, zero revenue, and only a couple dozen employees. So what made him invest $20 million? Jack Ma's eyes. Not because they were beautiful, but because they conveyed leadership. Perhaps Masayoshi Son recognized the energy of himself in Jack Ma. Perhaps his meeting reminded him of that fateful day with the head of McDonald's Japan. Either way, this investment paid off. When Alibaba went public, it was worth around $90 billion. This means Masayoshi saw a return of over 4,500%. This single investment not only saved SoftBank from going the way of Alta Vista and GeoCities, it has gone on to become a cornerstone of SoftBank's investment portfolio. This stability would be vital in the most important step of Masayoshi Son's ultimate vision. Yet, it was his belief in growth above all else that almost led to his ruin once and for all. Chapter 4. Planting Capital. The Vision Fund is the most ambitious move in the history of tech investing. The basic idea is to drive innovation by fending off competitors at all costs, costs being the key word. The plan is simple. Buy up the most promising startups and give them endless resources to bring to scale. Even if they make a loss, they'll be able to outlast rivals to become the go-to company for its product or service. To date, SoftBank has invested over $100 billion in its Vision Fund. That's the largest investment fund ever. It's enough to buy and ruin Twitter 2.5 times. The Vision Fund is a bold idea, yet going from conception to funding to investing only took a few years. Investments included Uber, DoorDash, and Nvidia. It also has stakes in companies focusing on real estate technology, satellite broadband, hospitality services, and semiconductor manufacturing. That's a lot of fingers in a lot of pies. Heck, that's a lot of pie factories. If the Vision Fund pays off, then almost every tech you use, from computer parts to apps, will have come from something in the investment portfolio. So how on earth is Masayoshi Son bankrolling this Quest world-sized future? And yes, that is a bespoke reference to an underrated Cartoon Network show from the 90s. Some cash has come from tech giants like Apple and Masayoshi Son's old partner at Sharp Corporation. These companies have put up $5.5 billion. $15 billion came courtesy of Abu Dhabi Mabudala, aka a sovereign wealth fund from the United Arab Emirates. SoftBank also put in their own cash, $33.1 billion to be exact, but the bulk of the support came from one single source. According to legend, Masayoshi Son convinced the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to invest $45 billion in just 45 minutes. That's $1 billion for each minute in the meeting. $45 billion is also America's combined annual budgets for education and public transportation, in case you weren't sure how much money that is. All it took was promising the heir in waiting a return of $1 trillion. We can't know any more details because SoftBank has been tight-lipped on its investment strategy. We can only go into its public actions. That's why a few scandals suggest its rapid growth is unsustainable. For starters, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia came under scrutiny when it was revealed that he ordered a journalist be assassinated inside an embassy. With such a flagrant disregard of international law and, morals, it's understandable why additional partners are getting second thoughts of working with a cutthroat businessman. Then there are the companies and industries that failed. Zoom was a 2015 venture to revolutionize food manufacturing and technology by inventing pizza-making robots. Their tech would have been the next big thing since sliced bread, especially with SoftBank being able to pull resources and expertise from Boston Dynamics. However, it turns out getting robots to make pizzas inside moving delivery vans isn't practical. Customers complained so much that they shelved the idea to focus on artificial intelligence for food service. When their automated food trucks failed to impress, they pivoted once more, this time to compostable food packaging. It might be a neat idea, but these moves away from its innovative origins meant that the company had lost its purpose. The end result was a bunch of failed experiments, a loss of direction, and a whole bunch of wasted money. The plug was pulled on Zoom in 2023. But hey, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, right? And you can't make a pizza without firing a few robots. Not everything in the portfolio will become the next Alibaba. However, the real issue is when a bad investment grows so much that it creates its own bubble. Even Masayoshi Son knows this. That's why he publicly apologized for investing in WeWork. Chapter 5. Growing Pains. The office space rental company was founded in 2010 by Adam Neumann. If you've seen HBO's Silicon Valley, then you'll be familiar with the clown CEO trope. To sum up Adam Neumann, he's the kind of guy who invests in pitches from strangers he meets while surfing. But that's not because he has some trick for detecting a good idea. He just never uses his own money. For example, he owned 4 of the original buildings leased to WeWork. That way, if the company went bust, he still got paid. The guy even personally trademarked the We brand, which he sold to his own company for $5.9 million. So why didn't Masayoshi Son hear the alarm bells? Because his weakness for a charismatic personality got the better of him. He fell for Adam Neumann's Willy Wonka bullshit, hook, line, and sinker. After the initial WeWork pitch, he told Neumann, "That's great, but let's make it even bigger." In 2017, the Vision Fund coughed up $6.5 billion for the hot desk startup. Instantly, WeWork had become the most sought-after enterprise. In 2019, Masayoshi Son was so confident in the project that SoftBank chucked up an extra $9.5 billion. People were so desperate to be a part of the WeWork story that its value shot up to a staggering $47 billion. Yet, skeptics couldn't make sense of the numbers. WeWork was outpaced by its closest competitor, IWG, on every metric. Floor space, membership, cost, heck. IWG even made a profit. WeWork only made a loss. In the first 6 months of 2019, WeWork lost $690 million. Money was being blown on unchallenged growth into new territories, flashy branding, ridiculous luxuries like private jets, and even off-the-wall experiments like the company's own in-house kindergarten called WeGrow. It was growing in all directions as fast as possible. Analysts were left scratching their heads. How on earth was its valuation justified if it was too big to make money? Was it possible SoftBank knew something they didn't? No. Far from it. No one knew what was going on. Around this time, Masayoshi Son actually bragged about wishing he could invest more into the company. Unfortunately for him, the other board members of SoftBank stopped Masayoshi Son from writing blank checks. That was the closest anyone got to restricting the amount of money being funneled into the company. But reality came tumbling down when WeWork prepared to go public. As soon as their financial books were open to the public, it became clear that Masayoshi Son had made a terrible mistake. He immediately ordered WeWork to pull back its IPO. But it was too late. The company couldn't afford to pay the hundreds of employees it was about to fire. Rank-and-file workers left the office with a cardboard box of all their items, but no severance package. However, the same couldn't be said for the higher-ups. Adam Neumann got a severance package of $1.7 billion. No wonder he voted for himself to be removed as the CEO during an emergency board meeting. Maybe they found that cash behind the back of the couch. WeWork cut back on costs, like the private jet, and made it known that their biggest liability had been kicked out of the company. But it was too late. The reputation was trashed, the value had plummeted, and the funding was drying up. Then the COVID pandemic hit, which took out what remained of the office space rental business plan. By the time Masayoshi Son publicly came out to explain what the hell had gone wrong, it had become clear that his pet project had wasted billions upon billions of dollars. WeWork had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy at the end of 2023. Masayoshi Son has done what he can to brush the scandal under the rug, but his reputation could be ruined forever. Before, he was the guy who could spot potential industries and survive market crashes. Now, people see him as a gambler, hedging his bets with other people's money. Then again, this isn't the first time he came close to losing it all. So maybe his strategy for growth still has potential. No one knows which other companies in the Vision Fund could be the next WeWork, though some are confident he's learned from his lesson enough. Let's hope so, because if he doesn't pay back that Saudi prince, then Masayoshi Son could be getting an early severance. Alfred Winslow Jones created the world's first hedge fund and changed the financial landscape forever. Yet, he didn't start out as an investment banker. In fact, he started out as a Marxist. His studies in sociology and career in journalism helped him figure out a neat trick for finessing the market. At the time, his novel idea flew under the radar. Fast forward just 5 short decades, and hedge funds now have over $5 trillion in assets under management. That's why some people curse Jones's invention. They say his idea only helps the elites while working folk pay the price for market crashes. They say lack of regulation means hedge funds are shady and helped cause the global financial crisis. However, finance fans will protect Alfred Winslow Jones with an ironclad defense. Hate the game, not the player. They say it's the bad bankers who ruined the hedge fund. They say only a man with Jones's life experience could figure out how to make sure everyone wins, assuming you can afford to play. So how did an academic crack Wall Street before investors did? How did his money-making machine go unnoticed for so long? And what even is a hedge fund anyway? Chapter 1. Roots of Change. Alfred Winslow Jones was born in Australia in the year 1900, but moved across the world to New York when he was just 4 years old. His father was Arthur Winslow Jones, an executive at General Electric tasked with expanding the operation across the Southern Hemisphere. This means young Alfred would have grown up in a household where mixing science and business paid the bills. You'd think Alfred would pursue these topics at Harvard, but instead he graduated in 1923 with a degree in classics, and good thing too. A broad intellectual education with a deep understanding of civilizations was the exact foundation he needed to glean radical insight in the years to come. To start, the fresh-faced graduate worked on a steamer as a purser. That's the treasurer for a boat. He'd deal with everything from ticket sales, employee lunch tokens, and customs fees. By working in administration while seeing different cultures and walks of life, he was learning about universal truths and financial principles. Think of it like wax on, wax off. But I guess in money terms, it's more like tax on, tax off. After traveling the world, he joined the Foreign Service. Now he was on a path to work at the US Embassy in Berlin, right when Hitler was coming to power. Not that he predicted that, of course. But what this suggests is Alfred was learning to appreciate how quickly a micro detail affects a macro scale. He was a socialist after all, so naturally he was fascinated with synthesizing conflicting ideas and forces. In fact, during his time at the Berlin embassy, he was so passionate about Soviet communism that it unnerved his colleagues. He studied at the Marxist Workers' School and wrote in liberal publication The New Republic under a pseudonym YKW. His 1933 writings criticized the Nazis before it was cool. When he wasn't jobbing at the embassies, he was moonlighting as a sleuth for German socialists, where he helped compile dossiers of Nazi war crimes. Come 1936, he was testing this skill when he traveled across Spain during its civil war. As a journalist, he documented civilian relief efforts. By 1937, he volunteered for Loyalist Spain, where he helped raise international support for the Spanish Republic. He'd seen politics through the lens of diplomacy and the proletariat, so returned to the US to road test some ideas of his own. Jones started an institution to use sociological and economics research to redirect policy towards greater social equality, but World War II started soon after, so that put a pin in the whole idea. But all this shows how the creator of the hedge fund didn't come from some conservative background trained to use his financial skills for profit. Alfred Winslow Jones was an educated, cultured, adventurous man. He was experienced with the machines of politics and capitalism, yet familiar with the grassroots movements of democracy, liberalism, and economics. By now, he'd accumulated a lifetime worth of experience in different cultures, countries, and concepts. He found himself caught between both sides of the spectrum, yet was working towards a way to find a safe middle. He wanted to find a way to hedge the risks from a country being too right-wing and too left-wing. He just needed a way to nail his idea down once and for all. So, in 1941, he earned his sociology doctorate at Columbia University. After 40 years on planet Earth, Alfred Winslow Jones had come to understand the mechanics of the unpredictable. From Hitler's rise to Franco's downfall, from dealing with diplomats to dealing with port customs. Alfred had unknowingly strengthened the muscles he needed to lift up the world's financial system. But none of it would have happened without a chance encounter. Chapter 2. Cultivating Potential. As soon as middle-aged socialist Alfred entered the workforce, capitalism was jump-starting post-war America. It was a time when soldiers came home to start families. Rationing was over. People were eager to spend their savings. Consumer spending rose. Housing increased. Labor movements rewrote the rules of work contracts, and employees were more prepared to go on strike. There could not have been better conditions for Alfred to put his theories into practice. It would be the equivalent of a physicist wanting to study gravity right when trips to the moon were free of charge. During these years, Alfred worked for Fortune magazine, yet his credentials and experience didn't get him projects covering finance. He reported on farming cooperatives, Atlantic convoys of Allied forces, and perhaps the most political subject of all, boys' prep schools. Then came along his big break. In 1949, Alfred was tasked with a piece called Fashions in Forecasting. It was an investigative piece exploring the technical methods of market analysis. In layman's terms, it was an article about how big brains picked the right tools to study tiny numbers. All very meta stuff, if you're into that type of thing. His angle was highlighting how a new class of stock market timers use their techniques to predict the direction of the market. Basically, he wanted to know how much of these ideas were science and how much were guesswork. Turns out, of the dozen or so traders he hung around, there was no consensus. Some used trading volume and price-to-earnings ratios. Others used odd-lot statistics. Some even relied on the outcomes of college football games. Alfred had lifted the hood on different vehicles of capitalism, but instead of seeing high-powered engines, he discovered hamster wheels. But not all hamster wheels were bad. In his article, Alfred praised the analyses which had potential. One example that stood out was a market trend that succeeded itself 62.5 times out of 100 and reversed itself 37.5 times. The probability of obtaining such a result in a penny-tossing series is infinitesimal. To put it in simple English, Alfred realized that these traders may not have known exactly what they were doing, but that undoubtedly some of the tools work. It was the economics version of 1,000 monkeys at 1,000 typewriters. If Alfred could figure out which monkey actually knew how to write and which were just pressing random buttons, then he'd be onto a winner. Little did he know that the idea he was about to have would be bigger than he ever could have imagined. Chapter 3. Pruning the Portfolio. To separate the good from the bad, Alfred examined each method to find ones that offered better than fair game. Nowadays, such an approach is called factor-based portfolio construction. Don't worry if this money talk is intimidating. I am going to break it down. Alfred's hunch was that instead of predicting which way the market would go, it would be wiser to predict which stocks were in good shape. Think of it like a presidential election. The conventional model would have you predict which way the vote would go based on things like policies, popularity, and zeitgeist. You know, the reasons we pretend to care about. However, Alfred was looking for types of qualities that made for a good candidate regardless of political party. Youth, beauty, stable family with few scandals. You know, the reasons we actually care about. Once he felt he had synthesized a new investment framework, it was time to test his number crunching. Alfred set up A.W. Jones & Co. 2 months before his article went to press. The office wasn't flashy, just a shabby place on Broad Street, nothing like the headquarters of Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley. It's 1949. If his idea really was going to be a way to make unpredictable markets work for society, he wanted to be the guinea pig, especially if the 50s were looking to be as wealthy as the post-war boom. So what was his innovative strategy? Long and short stocks to create a market-neutral portfolio. This means that the portfolio's performance was less dependent on the overall market direction and more on the individual stock selection, thereby reducing exposure to market volatility. How'd he do it? He'd buy stocks that he expected to do well, but at the same time, he bet against stocks he didn't think would do well. When he needed more shares, he used leverage, kind of like using a credit card to buy stocks. When he didn't like a company, he sold short. It's kind of like selling your friend's borrowed PlayStation 5 on Facebook Marketplace, hoping they drop in price, and then buying him one back at a lower price, and then you pocket the profit. This balancing act helped hedge market volatility. He always bought as much stock as he sold short too. That way, any market-wide moves could be neutralized. Other investors were debating about whether we go all in on red or black at the roulette wheel, but Alfred knew that long-term success would come from knowing how to finesse the craps table. I hope these analogies were helpful. If you've seen our How Money Works channel, then you might be more comfortable with the ins and outs of how this all works. Don't worry if the fine print has been confusing, because the real innovation is what he did next. Chapter 4. Budding Fortunes. At the time, investment managers usually took a substantial flat fee to grow your money. But Alfred introduced a controversial idea which has since gone on to become the standard in the hedge fund industry, for better or worse: the 2 and 20 fee. 2% is what investors pay to have someone manage it. Invest $100, 2 of those dollars go straight to Alfred's pocket. This undercut competitors to help Alfred's firm attract investors. However, this might have made him look too cheap. Investment banking is like meat. Avoid the cheap stuff. To hedge that risk, Alfred also introduced a 20% cut of overall returns. This pill was hard to swallow at first because no one demanded such a high percentage, let alone some new kid on the block, let alone some new kid who hadn't even had experience with investing, especially a leftist who backpacked across Europe for a few summers. But Alfred's means of production approach made perfect sense. By giving up a small upfront fee in exchange for more off the back end, he proved to clients how he was personally invested in their portfolio. No profit, no fee. This wasn't some pump and dump. It was a radically different way to do things. Well, kind of. Alfred plucked the 20% number from Phoenician sea captains. It was their cut of the treasure they hauled back from dangerous expeditions. Looks like that classics degree came in handy. He put up about $30,000 of his own cash and raised the rest from investors to bring the first year's fund to $100,000. 1 year later, and he had an incredible 17.3% return. A skeptic might have called it beginner's luck, but it wasn't. Alfred's experiment was outperforming the best mutual fund over the past 5 years by a staggering 44%, and that was after fees. Over the next 10 years, he was the top performing fund in the country, beating second place by a whopping 87%. Yet no one knew what he was up to until 1966. That was the year Fortune magazine printed a scoop about his success. It was called "The Joneses Nobody Will Keep Up With." It lifted the lid on his project and the amount of money he was making. 130 hedge funds sprouted up within the next 3 years. Not to be outdone, Jones established the first hedge fund of hedge funds in 1969. One thing that helped grow the hedge fund industry was the relative instability of the 70s. The market crashes of 73 and 74 didn't destroy Alfred's project, which proved that his theory on hedging was able to withstand dire circumstances. In fact, over the 34-year lifespan of Alfred's fund of funds, he only ever made losses 3 times. Let's put that into perspective. The chance of successfully guessing the outcome of 5 consecutive coin tosses is roughly 3%, and if it's 10 consecutive tosses, it's less than 1%. For Alfred to be able to outdo the market almost perfectly for more than a generation proved that he had cracked the code. But soon he'd be left in the dust, and his tools for economic equality would become a get-rich-quick scheme for fat cats. Chapter 5. Reaping What You Sow. By the time the 80s hit, the economy was back in shape and other hedge funds had put their own spin on Alfred's formula. New strategies focused on arbitrage, macro investing, distressed investments, and all other sorts of finance bro speak. Yet, access was always restricted to the wealthy. Normies couldn't use them. You needed clout. But there's a reason for that. In order to have less regulation so that a hedge fund could take big risks, they could only accept clients with a proven track record of financial stability. A client needed to be earning at least $200,000 a year plus a liquid net worth of $1 million. Depending on when and where you are, the cost could be much higher. If you had that, then at least you knew something about how to make money. And there was a lot of money to make in the 1980s. For example, Julian Robertson started the Tiger Fund with $8 billion. At its peak in 1998, it was $22 billion. Throughout those 2 decades, the hedge fund industry ballooned. After the dot-com bubble, total assets under management were around $2 trillion. But then the market collapsed. The global financial crisis of 2008 took out a lot of hedge funds. Some collapsed due to their financial losses. Others withered when scared investors pulled out their capital. Some say they deserved it. Although subprime mortgage lending and investment banks were the central reason for the collapse, there were still plenty of hedge funds being careless. It's also the case that the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme made everyone much more suspicious of financial institutions. From then on, hedge funds came under much more scrutiny. We're talking more regulation, tougher rules, new policies, and entire government bodies to monitor them. This means Alfred's dream was over. Alfred started out by wanting to improve equality, but ultimately became the elite he swore to destroy. Once hedge funds became their own industry, government oversight slowed them down. Alfred had inadvertently created his own monster. That's probably why he completely removed himself from the business. Over time, he disengaged himself from his work and went back to his roots. He joined the Peace Corps, where he continued volunteering in humanitarian campaigns. He even tried to set up a reverse Peace Corps, where the nations who received aid could send their own volunteers to help America's poor and downtrodden. His idea was to hedge against creating a culture of inferiority amongst developing nations. It didn't work out, but you can't blame the guy for trying. He already tried to make society equal by making the market fair. It seems by the end of his life, he realized he could make people equal by treating them fairly. But tell me what you think. Was Alfred too much of an idealist? Is the free market the only way to spread equality? If you like this video, be sure to check out our one on the history of Goldman Sachs. And be sure to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.